The Revolutionary War was won. Soldiers returned home expecting a hero's welcome. Instead, many found crippling debt and the threat of debtor's prison. This was the harsh reality for veterans like Captain Daniel Shays. They had helped forge a new nation. Now that nation seemed ready to take their farms and their freedom. But you might ask, how could this happen? Why would heroes fight the government they created? This was not just a local dispute. It was a rebellion that exposed the fatal flaws of a young America. It forced a change that would shape its destiny forever. Victory in war often comes with a hefty price tag. For the new United States, the bill was coming due. The problem was, the country had no way to pay it. The nation was governed by the Articles of Confederation. This document created a central government so weak, it was practically a suggestion. It could ask the 13 states for money, but it couldn't force them to pay. It couldn't regulate trade between states, which quickly led to economic chaos. Each state acted like its own little country, with its own interests and tariffs. This created a nightmare for ordinary people. Imagine trying to sell your crops in a neighboring state. You might find your state's money is not accepted there. Trade, the lifeblood of the economy, slowed to a crawl. The dream of a united nation felt more like a clumsy group project, where no one did their part. To finance the war, Congress had printed vast amounts of paper money called continentals. Without gold or silver to back it up, its value plummeted. Soon, it was worth less than the paper it was printed on. A soldier's entire back pay might not even buy him dinner. Then there were the war bonds. These were essentially IOUs given to soldiers and suppliers as payment. But when people needed real money for food and to pay their own debts, they couldn't afford to wait. They sold their bonds for pennies on the dollar to wealthy speculators. These speculators, often based in cities like Boston, bought up the debt for almost nothing. Then they used their political influence to pressure the state governments to repay the bonds at their full face value. It was a brilliant, if ruthless way to make a fortune from the desperation of others. Massachusetts was in the deepest trouble. The state faced a staggering debt of around £1.5 million. To pay it off, the state government, controlled by those same wealthy coastal merchants, levied heavy taxes. These taxes had to be paid in hard currency, like gold or silver, which farmers simply did not have. The irony was brutal. Men who fought against taxation without representation now faced crushing taxes from their own government, a government that clearly favored the rich speculators over its own veterans. This wasn't just a financial crisis. It was a crisis of trust. Life in western Massachusetts was a world away from the bustling ports of Boston. Out here, cash was a rare sight. People lived by a system of barter and mutual credit. A blacksmith would shoe a farmer's horse in exchange for a side of bacon. A doctor might accept firewood as payment for setting a broken bone. Your wealth wasn't in a vault. It was in your land, your tools, and your reputation with your neighbors. Then, in 1786, the government in Boston dropped a bomb. A new, aggressive tax was levied to pay off the state's massive debt, and it had to be paid in specie, meaning gold or silver coin. This was like asking someone who only trades in vegetables to suddenly pay their bills in diamonds. It was an impossible demand. For these farmers, their land and their labor were their only currency. When a farmer couldn't pay, the process was swift and brutal. A court summons would arrive. To defend yourself, you had to travel for days to a courthouse. You had to pay fees you didn't have. You had to face judges who were often the very same speculators holding your debt. The outcome was rarely in doubt. The court system became a factory for foreclosure. According to sources from the period, in some counties, up to a third of all male citizens were being sued for debt. If you lost your case, the local sheriff would arrive to seize your property. First, they took your livestock. Then your tools, the very things you needed to work your land. Finally, they took the land itself. Imagine watching your family's farm, worked for generations, sold at auction for a fraction of its worth. Your life's work vanished to settle a debt to a distant merchant you had never even met. This wasn't just an economic policy. It felt like a deliberate attack. What were these men supposed to do? Daniel Shays was no firebrand revolutionary. He was a farmer from western Massachusetts who answered the call of duty. When the first shots of the revolution echoed from Lexington and Concord, he was there. He stood firm against the British regulars on the slopes of Bunker Hill. He survived the grueling Northern Campaign. He also played his part in the crucial American victory at Saratoga in 1777. Shays was a respected officer, a captain who earned his rank through courage, not connections. He served his new country for 5 long years. When the war was finally over, he returned home, not seeking glory. He simply wanted to work his land and live in peace. But like thousands of other soldiers, he was sent home without his promised pay. The government, barely holding itself together, had nothing to give. The only tangible recognition for his service was a magnificent ceremonial sword. It was a gift from the Marquis de Lafayette. The famous French general was a symbol of the Revolution's ideals. This sword was not just a weapon. It was a mark of honor, a personal tribute from one of the war's greatest heroes. It represented the noble cause and the victory he had helped secure. It was proof that his service mattered. But honor could not pay the tax collector. It could not satisfy the Boston merchants, who now held his debts. As the courts began to circle, threatening his farm, Shays faced a humiliating reality. He needed cash. Desperate, he sold his most prized possession, the sword from Lafayette, the very symbol of his patriotic sacrifice, was pawned off for a handful of money. This single act captures the profound sense of betrayal felt by so many veterans. Their own government, the one they had created with their blood, was now stripping them of their property and their dignity. They had been heroes on the battlefield, but back home, they were being treated as nothing more than debtors. How long could they endure this? Before grabbing their muskets, the farmers of western Massachusetts reached for a tool they knew well. They organized people's conventions. This was a tradition forged during the Revolution itself. It was a way for ordinary citizens to gather, debate, and make their voices heard. They were not starting a riot. They were trying to start a dialogue. Delegates from towns all across the region began to meet. They drafted petitions and lists of grievances with a lawyerly precision. They were citizens exercising what they believed was their right. Their demands were clear and consistent. First, they wanted the state to issue paper money. This would provide the cash they desperately needed to pay taxes and their debts. They also demanded a temporary halt to the crushing debt lawsuits. They called for the state capital to be moved from Boston. They felt the government was too close to the wealthy merchants and too far from them. It was a reasonable attempt to rebalance the scales of power and justice. The movement came to a head in August 1786. Delegates from dozens of towns gathered for a major convention in the town of Hatfield. They formally adopted a powerful list of grievances. This was a unified message sent eastward to the state government. They were not asking for a handout. They were asking for fairness. The governor of Massachusetts at the time was James Bowdoin. He was a wealthy Boston merchant, one of the very men profiting from the farmers' debt. He read their petitions not as pleas for help, but as acts of sedition. He declared the conventions unconstitutional and dangerous to the Republic. There would be no negotiation. The message from Boston was loud and clear. Your petitions are worthless. Your meetings are illegal. Pay your debts or lose your farms. The door for peaceful resolution had just been slammed shut. With all legal and political options exhausted, the farmers were backed into a corner. When peaceful men are left with no peaceful choices, something has to give. Governor Bauduin had drawn a line in the sand. With their petitions scornfully rejected, the farmers decided to stop asking and start acting. Their target was not the distant government in Boston. It was the immediate instrument of their suffering, the Court of Common Pleas. The strategy was brilliantly simple. If the courts could not sit, they could not issue any more foreclosure orders. It was a direct, surgical strike against the system that was ruining them. They began calling themselves the Regulators. The name had a history, echoing earlier protests against corrupt officials. To show their unity, they tucked a sprig of green hemlock into their hats. It was a simple symbol, a piece of the very land they were fighting to protect. This was no angry mob. It was an organized force of desperate veterans. On August 29, 1786, the plan went into motion. According to sources from the period, around 1,500 regulators, with Daniel Shays among their leaders, marched on the courthouse in Northampton. They were not there to burn it down or cause violence. They simply formed lines and stood their ground. They physically prevented judges and court officials from entering the building. No shots were fired. The message was unmistakable. The court was closed. This success was quickly replicated across western Massachusetts. In Worcester, hundreds more regulators blocked the courthouse. In Concord, they did the same, effectively shutting down the legal system in the region. The machinery grinding farmers into poverty had been brought to a screeching halt. The state government's response was conspicuous by its absence. There was no army to send. The only available force, the local militia, presented a major problem. Its ranks were filled with the farmers' own sons, brothers, and neighbors. When called to defend the courts against their own people, many militiamen simply refused to act. Some even switched sides and joined the regulators, hemlock sprig and all. The state government was revealed to be completely powerless. The rebellion was winning. As news of the shuttered courts spread, a quiet panic rippled through the country's elite. What was happening in Massachusetts was not just a local tax dispute anymore. This was a direct challenge to the very authority of Republican government. If a state could be defied, what did that say about the nation? Leaders in other states watched nervously. They knew their own veterans were just as poor and just as angry. This fire could easily jump state lines. The problem landed on the desk of Henry Knox, the nation's Secretary of War. As a former general, Knox understood military threats better than anyone. He recognized the immediate danger this posed to the entire country. He urgently petitioned the Continental Congress to raise a federal army and restore order. He warned them that the rebellion was a formidable body of men. He feared it could spread like a virus to other states. But Knox's plea ran into the hard reality of the Articles of Confederation. Under this system, Congress had no power to raise a national army for domestic issues. It also had no power to levy federal taxes to pay for one. The national government was effectively a spectator in its own crisis. It could only watch as Massachusetts descended into chaos. They could not send a single soldier to put out the fire. Desperate and embarrassed, Congress tried a bit of political subterfuge. They authorized raising about 1,300 troops. The official reason given was an upcoming conflict with Native Americans in the Ohio Territory. It was a flimsy excuse that fooled nobody. Even then, the plan failed. Congress couldn't properly fund the force, and Virginia flatly refused to contribute, arguing it was a Massachusetts problem. This paralysis led to an absurd situation. The United States government owned a major federal arsenal right in Springfield, Massachusetts. It was filled with thousands of muskets, cannons, and barrels of gunpowder. That very arsenal was now a primary target for the rebels, who desperately needed more weapons. Yet the national government that owned the arsenal was legally and financially incapable of defending it. The crisis revealed a fatal truth. The country was a nation in name only. A government that could not keep the peace or protect its own property was no government at all. With the national government paralyzed and the state militia unreliable, Governor Bauduin was a leader in name only. The western half of his state was effectively controlled by the regulators. For Boston's elite, their entire world was teetering on the brink of collapse. If the rebellion succeeded, their loans would become worthless. Their political power would simply evaporate. So they did what the wealthy have always done when the government fails to protect their interests. They opened their own wallets. Bauduin launched what was essentially a private fundraising campaign. He appealed directly to Boston's wealthiest citizens, the very speculators and merchants who held the farmers' debts. The response was swift. A group of the city's most prominent men pledged over £6,000 to create a private army. This was no ragtag militia. It was a well-funded military force with a single ruthless purpose: to crush the rebellion and reopen the courts. It was nothing less than class warfare, financed by subscription. To lead this new army, they needed a man with impeccable credentials. They chose General Benjamin Lincoln. Lincoln was no stranger to command, having been a respected major general in the Continental Army. He had served alongside George Washington and formally accepted the British surrender at Yorktown. He was a man of the establishment, deeply committed to law and order. In January 1787, Lincoln's privately funded army mobilized with incredible speed. In just a few weeks, he assembled a professional force of 4,400 well-equipped soldiers. They were paid, supplied, and ready to march west into the snow-covered hills of Massachusetts. The stage was now set for a direct confrontation. On one side stood Daniel Shays and his army of desperate farmers fighting for their land. On the other stood General Lincoln, leading an army paid for by the very men who wanted to take it all away. The brutal winter of January 1787 had arrived. Deep snow covered the hills of western Massachusetts, making every road a frozen ordeal. For Daniel Shays and the regulators, time was running out. General Lincoln's private army was marching west, and the rebels knew it. Their only hope was to seize a massive advantage before his superior force could arrive. They needed a game-changing victory, and they needed it now. Their target was the United States Arsenal at Springfield. This was not just another courthouse. It was one of the major military depots in the entire country, filled with thousands of muskets and tons of gunpowder. For the poorly armed farmers, capturing the arsenal meant transforming their rebellion overnight. It would give them the firepower to face Lincoln's army on more equal terms. Shays devised a daring and complex plan. He would lead his main force of about 1,200 men from the east. Two other rebel commanders, Luke Day and Eli Parsons, would lead smaller columns from the west and north. The three groups would converge on the arsenal at the exact same time. The goal was to overwhelm its defenders with a coordinated surprise attack. On paper, it was a solid military strategy. But the problem with 18th century plans is they relied on messengers. Shays sent a note to Luke Day, proposing they launch the attack on January 25th. It was a simple message, the kind any commander sends to coordinate forces. That single piece of paper would prove to be the rebellion's death warrant. The message was intercepted. Inside the arsenal, General William Shepard commanded a force of loyal militiamen. He now knew the rebels' entire strategy. He knew when they were coming, where they were coming from, and how many there were. As Shays and his men trudged through the deep snow toward Springfield, they were filled with grim determination. They believed they held the element of surprise. They were marching not toward a vulnerable target, but directly into a perfectly laid trap. A small aside. If you are enjoying this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. You will help us a lot to continue making more content like this. Truly, even though it's a simple click, it's the motivation we have to continue sharing history. Thank you. The afternoon of January 25th, 1787, was bitterly cold. Daniel Shays and his column of farmers emerged from the snow-laden trees. They advanced in a surprisingly orderly line toward the Springfield arsenal. They were confident, unaware that their grand coordinated attack was already a failure. Luke Day's supporting force had decided to wait another day, a decision Shays knew nothing about. Inside the arsenal, General Shepard watched them approach. His 1,200 militiamen were ready. He knew the rebels' numbers and their objective. He had positioned his cannons to command the approach, turning the snowy field into a killing ground. As the regulators got within range, Shepard gave a clear warning. He ordered his artillery to fire 2 shots high over their heads. The roar of the cannons echoed across the valley. The iron bowls whistled harmlessly through the winter air. For a moment, the advancing line of farmers paused. Perhaps they believed it was a bluff. They had faced down the militia before, without a fight. They had fought alongside men like this during the Revolution. Surely they would not fire on their own countrymen. So they reformed their line and continued their advance. It was a fatal miscalculation. Shepard gave the final order. The artillerymen lowered their cannons and fired again. This time they were not loaded with solid shot. They were loaded with grape shot, essentially turning each cannon into a giant shotgun. A cloud of iron balls ripped through the center of the rebel formation. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. The organized line of men dissolved into pure chaos and terror. In a single volley, 4 rebels were killed, and another 20 were wounded. The men who had stood firm at Bunker Hill now broke and ran for their lives. They dropped their muskets and fled back into the woods. The assault on the arsenal was over in less than a minute. The rebellion's heart had just been shattered by a blast of iron. The rout at Springfield was more than a defeat. It was the end of the dream. The scattered and demoralized regulators fled into the frozen countryside with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Their cause was lost, and now survival was the only thing that mattered. Just as their hopes collapsed, General Lincoln's professional army finally arrived in western Massachusetts. The hunt was on. Daniel Shays managed to lead the freezing remnants of his force northeast. They regrouped in the small town of Petitions, believing the brutal winter storm raging around them offered a temporary shield. They were exhausted, hungry, and thought they had a moment to catch their breath. They assumed no army would dare march in such conditions. But General Lincoln was a different kind of soldier. When he learned of the rebels' location, he saw the blizzard not as an obstacle, but as a weapon. He made a decision that seemed insane to his officers. He ordered his men to prepare for an immediate night march. His army set out on a grueling 30-mile trek through the raging snowstorm. All through the night, his well-supplied troops pushed through waist-deep snow and blinding wind. It was a testament to their discipline and Lincoln's iron will. They marched in near silence, a ghost army moving through the whiteout, completely invisible to the unsuspecting rebels. At dawn on February 4th, 1787, Lincoln's army descended on Petitions. The regulators were caught completely by surprise. Many were still asleep in the town's homes and barns. There was no time to form a battle line or even grab a weapon. It was chaos. Men scrambled out into the blizzard, trying to escape the sudden and total collapse of their position. The fight was over before it began. Lincoln's troops captured 150 rebels without firing a shot. The last organized force of the rebellion was shattered. In the confusion, Daniel Shays and a few other leaders slipped away. They fled north, crossing the border into the independent Republic of Vermont, now fugitives from the nation they once fought to create. The fighting had stopped, but the government's war on the regulators was just beginning. The administration in Boston wanted to make a brutal example of the rebels. They swiftly passed a disqualification act. This law stripped anyone who had taken part in the uprising of their most basic civil rights. They could not vote, hold office, or even work as school teachers. Hundreds of former regulators were rounded up and dragged before the courts. The trials were quick, and the outcomes were rarely in doubt. The state was seeking vengeance, not justice. In the end, 14 men were sentenced to death by hanging, including several key leaders of the rebellion. The gallows were being prepared. Yet, the government hesitated to execute the rebellion's political leaders. Instead, they made a different kind of example. 2 men, John Bly and Charles Rose, were publicly hanged. Their official crime was not treason against the state. It was simple looting committed during the chaos. Their execution sent a clear message. The state would tolerate no lawlessness, no matter the cause. But the public mood was shifting. Many people felt the harsh punishments were cruel and excessive. In the next election, the voters of Massachusetts spoke loudly. They threw the hardline Governor Bowdoin out of office. They replaced him with John Hancock, a popular and more forgiving figure from the Revolution. Hancock understood that healing the state was more important than vengeance. He began issuing widespread pardons, commuting most of the death sentences. He believed forcing the men to swear an oath of allegiance was a better path forward for everyone. Reconciliation, not retribution, became the new policy of Massachusetts. This wave of mercy eventually reached the man whose name was on everyone's lips. In 1788, even Daniel Shays, still hiding out as a fugitive in Vermont, was officially pardoned. He could finally return home. The rebellion was over, but the political storm it had unleashed was about to change America forever. While the rebellion was being crushed in the snows of Massachusetts, news of the uprising traveled south. It reached a quiet plantation on the banks of the Potomac River. At Mount Vernon, George Washington was trying to enjoy his retirement. He had won the war and wanted nothing more than to be a farmer. But the news from the north filled him with a profound sense of dread. Publicly, Washington remained silent. Privately, his letters burned with anxiety. Writing to his old friend Henry Knox, he confessed he was mortified beyond expression. He could not believe that Americans were turning on the very idea of government itself. What was the point of winning the revolution if the country was just going to tear itself apart? This was not a protest. In his eyes, it was a descent into anarchy. He saw the weakness of the national government not as a political problem, but as an existential threat. The United States, he feared, was becoming a joke on the world stage. He wrote to James Madison that the country was fast verging to anarchy and confusion. For Washington, the rebellion was proof of his darkest fear. Mankind, when left to themselves, he wrote, are unfit for their own government. This crisis forced him to a painful conclusion. His work was not done. The nation he had led to victory was now on the verge of collapse. The Articles of Confederation were a demonstrated failure, a rope of sand unable to hold the states together. When an invitation arrived to attend a convention in Philadelphia to discuss revising them, he knew he could no longer refuse. His friends pleaded with him to go, arguing his presence was essential to give the meeting legitimacy. The chaos in Massachusetts was the final, undeniable argument. The quiet farmer had to become the nation's leader once again. The desperate actions of Daniel Shays had inadvertently achieved what no politician could. They had pulled George Washington out of retirement to save the Republic. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, the news from Massachusetts arrived with a different flavor. In the sophisticated salons of Paris, Thomas Jefferson was serving as the American ambassador to France. Surrounded by the radical ideas of the French Enlightenment, he received reports of the uprising, not with panic, but with a cool philosophical detachment. For him, the chaos was not a sign of the Republic's failure. It was a sign of its health. In a letter to James Madison, he penned a line that must have shocked his friends back home. He wrote, "I hold it that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing." He compared it to a storm in the atmosphere, arguing it was just as necessary in the political world. From his perspective, governments would always eventually become oppressive if left completely unchecked. Popular uprisings were the people's natural medicine against a sick government. They were a vital reminder to rulers that the people were watching. He believed the farmers were not traitors or anarchists. He saw them as citizens acting in the same spirit as the revolution of 1776. They were resisting what they perceived as tyranny, and Jefferson could hardly fault them for that. His distance from the actual violence and chaos allowed him to see the rebellion not as a crisis, but as a principle in action. He was not a wealthy Boston merchant whose investments were at risk. He took this idea even further in another famous letter. "The tree of liberty," he wrote, "must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." This was not a call for constant bloodshed. It was a stark declaration that liberty is not a monument to be admired from afar. It is a living thing that requires nourishment, vigilance, and sometimes profound sacrifice to keep alive. This view stood in dramatic contrast to the horrified letters coming from Mount Vernon. While Washington saw the nation descending into anarchy, Jefferson saw citizens doing their duty. This profound disagreement exposed a fundamental debate at the heart of the American experiment. How could a nation be both strong and free? The rebellion had ended, but this question was just getting started. The story of the Massachusetts farmers was no longer their own. Once the fighting stopped, a new battle began, a battle of public perception. Newspapers from Boston to Philadelphia began to paint a terrifying picture. They were not writing about desperate veterans seeking justice. They were writing about a dangerous mob. The rebels were branded as levelers, a word that struck fear into the hearts of property owners. The term implied they wanted to abolish all private debt and redistribute wealth by force. They were described as anarchists, lawless men bent on destroying the very foundations of government. It was a highly effective smear campaign. You can almost picture a wealthy merchant in his city home, reading these sensational accounts over his morning coffee. He had read about the revolution with pride. Now he was reading about this new uprising with pure terror. This was not a fight for liberty. This looked like a direct attack on his wallet. This fear was not just paranoia. Leaders in other states knew their own populations were simmering with similar resentments. Pennsylvania, Virginia, and the Carolinas were filled with indebted farmers and angry veterans. What was stopping them from getting the same idea? Shays Rebellion was viewed as a political disease, and it looked highly contagious. For men like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, who had long argued for a stronger national government, the uprising was a political gift. It was the ultimate "I told you so" moment. They no longer had to speak of theoretical dangers. They could simply point to the chaos in Massachusetts as proof. The image of the noble farmer patriot, the minuteman who stood up to a king, was being replaced. In its place was the specter of the Shaysite, a wild-eyed radical threatening to burn down the entire American experiment for personal gain. Suddenly, the fear of too much liberty seemed more dangerous than the fear of too much government. Anarchy was the new enemy, and it demanded a new, stronger weapon to fight it. Just months before Massachusetts farmers took up arms, a meeting was held in Annapolis, Maryland. The goal was to discuss the country's crippling trade problems. It was an absolute failure. Only a handful of states even bothered to send delegates. The message was clear. There was no real urgency, no widespread desire for a stronger central government. The idea of major reform was politely shelved for another time. Then the political earthquake hit. News of armed mobs shutting down courts in a sovereign state changed everything. The abstract debate about tariffs was suddenly replaced by the visceral image of a nation on the brink of civil war. The failed experiment in Annapolis was about to be resurrected by the fires of rebellion. Those sensational newspaper reports were the perfect catalyst. They provided men like James Madison with the political ammunition they had been missing. He could now write to leaders in other states, not with theories, but with cold, hard evidence of the nation's fragility. Even George Washington's influential home state of Virginia, which had been lukewarm on major reform, was now thoroughly alarmed. The chaos was too close to home. The timing tells the whole story. The rebellion was effectively crushed in early February of 1787. The psychological shockwave, however, was just beginning to spread. Almost immediately, the call went out for a new convention to be held that May in Philadelphia. This time, it was not an optional meeting about trade. It was an emergency session to save the Republic from itself. As delegates from across the country began their journey to Philadelphia, they carried the ghost of the rebellion with them. Their mandate, spoken or not, was clear. They were not there simply to amend the Articles of Confederation. They were there to create a government with teeth, a government that could raise an army, collect taxes, and protect property. They were there to build a system that could prevent another Shays Rebellion from ever happening again. The delegates who gathered in Philadelphia during the sweltering summer of 1787 met in strict secrecy. The windows of the State House were nailed shut, but the real pressure was not the heat. It was the memory of what had just happened in Massachusetts. The ghost of Daniel Shays was an unofficial delegate in the room, and his presence shaped every debate. These men were not just designing a government based on high-minded ideals. They were building a firebreak. They were creating a system powerful enough to stop the flames of rebellion from ever spreading again. Delegates like Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, who had witnessed the chaos firsthand, argued that the country had suffered from an excess of democracy. The fear of the levelers and their demands became a powerful argument for a stronger, more centralized authority. This fear was hammered directly into the new Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, gave the new Congress the explicit power to call forth the militia in order to suppress insurrections. This was the Shays Rebellion Clause. It was a direct answer to the paralysis of the old government. Never again would the nation be a helpless spectator while a state teetered on the brink of collapse. They also addressed the problem of leadership. The embarrassing spectacle of a state governor needing to fund a private army was fresh in their minds. The new Constitution created a powerful executive branch headed by a single president. This president would be the commander-in-chief, capable of acting decisively in a crisis without begging for funds or permission. And to pay for it all, the new government was given the one power it so desperately lacked: the power to tax. The federal government could now raise its own revenue to fund a national army. No more relying on unreliable states or wealthy donors to protect a federal arsenal. The document that emerged from Philadelphia was a masterpiece of political engineering, but it was forged in fear. The fear of a powerful king had been replaced by a more immediate fear of anarchy from within. The Constitution created a government strong enough to protect liberty, but also strong enough to protect property from the people themselves. In the grand sweep of American history, the story of Daniel Shays and his regulators often gets lost. It is a brief, messy episode sandwiched between two monumental events. These were the glorious victory of the Revolution and the profound creation of the Constitution. It is easy to see it as a mere footnote, a failed uprising of angry farmers, but that view misses the point entirely. So who were these men, really? The city newspapers of the time painted a clear picture of dangerous traitors. They were described as levelers and anarchists, a lawless mob bent on destroying government. Was this the truth? Or could they have been the last true soldiers of the Revolution? They were fighting a new form of distant government that felt hauntingly familiar. This historical debate has never been fully settled. What is clear is that the rebellion served a vital, if unintended, purpose. It was the first great stress test of the new American Republic, and the Republic failed spectacularly. The uprising exposed the national government under the Articles of Confederation as a hollow shell. It was incapable of maintaining order or protecting its own citizens. It was a public demonstration that the nation's founding document was not up to the job. This created a legacy that echoes to this day. The conflict between the farmers and the Boston elite was not just about taxes and debt. It was about a fundamental tension that still lies at the heart of American life. This is the core tension between the need for a stable government and the people's right to resist injustice. It is the enduring fight between economic fairness and the protection of property. The rebellion forced these uncomfortable questions onto the national stage. The answers the founders gave were written directly into the Constitution. They created a stronger federal government to ensure stability. But the questions themselves never went away. The rebellion is a powerful reminder that the struggle to define America's soul did not end at Yorktown. In many ways, it was just getting started. We hope you found this exploration of Shays Rebellion truly insightful. This pivotal, yet often overlooked, chapter of American history was instrumental in shaping the nation that we live in today. The echoes of this desperate uprising forced a crucial conversation about liberty and order that continues even now. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the past. Your support is absolutely essential. It helps us continue to tell these vital stories that are simply too important to ever be forgotten. Thank you for watching.